Greetings. The title of this lecture is Constantine. The history of world Christianity is a story of countless amazing people, many who held no political office, had no artistic talents, or any other achievement that brought them great status. There are countless Christians who we have no record of, but one who is remembered to this day is the great emperor Constantine. Historians debate on whether Constantine was a genuine Christian. Those who believe he was a Christian are also divided on how best to assess his faith. It is notable that the Orthodox Catholic Church recognizes him as a saint, whereas the Roman Catholic Church does not. But there is no debate on whether he had a major impact on Christianity. Whether or not he had a genuine Christian faith, his policies clearly transformed the place of Christianity in Europe. For 3 centuries of the Roman Empire, Christians faced varying degrees of persecution. Christians adored Jesus, who in the eyes of Roman leaders was simply a curious man who was executed as a subversive. Christians were looked upon with suspicion. They worshiped in secret and they shunned theaters, pagan temples, and other Roman activities. The Romans had found the monotheism of Judaism offensive, but Christianity was worse. It was worse because it was evangelistic. They began to see how this so-called offensive religion grew much faster than the pace of Judaism. Although Christians were not a menace to public order, the zealousness of their faith was disturbing. Roman leaders saw them as atheists because they did not worship the Roman gods. The Christians also demonstrated extraordinary passion for the religion. On the issue of Christian martyrdom, Cyprian of Carthage, in approximately 200 AD, wrote, "What will be the glory and how great the joy to be admitted, to see God, to be honored, to receive with Christ thy Lord God, the joy of eternal salvation and light, to greet Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the patriarchs and prophets and apostles and martyrs, to rejoice with the righteous and the friends of God in the kingdom of heaven, with the pleasure of immortality given to us, to receive there what neither eye has seen, nor ear heard, neither has entered into the heart of man." The fervor of such Christians was troublesome for the Roman state, as was the steady rise of Christianity. The existence of anti-Christian literature in the 3rd century indicates that Christianity was important enough that rebuttal was necessary. But the anti-Christian arguments were narrow-minded and often weak. Early church author Tertullian declared, "Day after day, indeed, you groan over the increasing number of the Christians. Your constant cry is that the state is beset, that Christians are in your fields, in your camps, in your islands. You grieve over it as a calamity, that each sex, either age, in short, every rank, is passing over from you to us. Yet you do not even alter this set your minds. Yet you do not even after this set your minds upon reflecting whether there be not here some latent good." Many Christians were doing good works, and this did not go unnoticed. By the mid 3rd century, Christians in Rome had enough resources to support 1,500 widows and others in need of assistance. In cities throughout the empire, Christians fed the poor, cared for orphans and old slaves, and buried the dead. But there were forces at work that spelled grief for Christians. By the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was in decline. Maintaining a large army and big government structure was costly. The military had its hands full with the threat of invaders, especially in the northern and eastern boundaries of the empire. Lots of activity among the barbarians. Christians always offered a convenient scapegoat for Roman leaders who wanted to divert anger away from leadership. Emperor Diocletian, who ruled from approximately 285 to 305, divided the empire at the Danube River, thinking that two leaders would make ruling a large empire more effective. The arrangement consisted of Diocletian controlling the east and Maximian controlling the west. There were also two junior emperors under these two, Galerius and Constantius. Even though his wife and daughter were Christians, Diocletian viewed Christianity as a divisive force in the Roman Empire. This position appears unreasonable given that Christians had never rebelled against the empire, and they normally stayed clear of politics. On the issue of Christianity's place in the empire, there were two courses for a Roman emperor. Either force a growing Christianity into submission or enter into alliance with it. Diocletian chose the former. He chose coercion. No other course could be expected from Diocletian, a man who, quote, was a rude but firm supporter of heathenism of the cruder camp type, end of quote. The problem for the anti-Christian leader was that there were Christians everywhere. Nonetheless, beginning in 303, Diocletian issued three great edicts of persecution in rapid succession. Churches were destroyed, sacred books confiscated, clergy imprisoned and tortured. In 304, a fourth edict required all Christians to offer sacrifices. It was a time of fearful persecution. However, there were hopeful signs for Christians when both emperors Diocletian and Maximian abdicated the throne in 305. With these abdications, the junior emperors Galerius and Constantius became emperors. But the following year, Constantius died and his army selected his son, Constantine, to take his place as emperor. Constantine was born approximately 288, and he was the illegitimate son of Constantius and Helena, who was a Christian. As a young boy, Constantine was kept in Diocletian's and Galerius' court, more or less as a hostage to guarantee the loyalty of his father being Constantius. Not everyone was happy with the arrangement of junior emperors, and there was a power struggle that unfolded. However, Christians welcomed the rise of Constantine as he decreed the return of property from Christians during the Great Persecution during the time of Diocletian. Constantine began a military campaign against his rival Max and Titus, and this was in the year 312. It was something that he had prepared for in the previous years. His military preparations and operations were well thought out. With his army, he crossed the Alps and descended upon Italy. Several successful battles in northern Italy brought him face to face with his rival. Before entering battle against Max and Titus, who was a pronounced partisan of heathenism, Constantine allegedly saw a vision of a cross and the notion of Christ. The experience was profound. Early Christian writers declared that he had directed his soldiers to paint the sign of a cross on their shields. After doing so, Constantine successfully defeated Max and Titus at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, which actually is still in existence. And this is approximately 5 miles north of Rome, or 8 kilometers. Max and Titus fell in the water and drowned. So Constantine was successful in this campaign. Constantine demanded the end of persecution of Christians in all areas. His edict in 312 granted Christians the right to practice their beliefs. The following year, the Edict of Milan presented additional freedoms for Christians. Interestingly, Constantine was the second political ruler to embrace Christianity. The first, several years earlier, was the Armenian king Tiridates III. Constantine was ambitious to extend his Roman territories. In the north, he set up a powerful base of operations in the region of what is today France and Great Britain. He controlled barbarians in the north by strengthening the borders along the Rhine. However, historian Justo Gonzalez points out that Constantine's love of luxury and pomp was a shortcoming. For example, he focused too much attention on his palace at the capital city. Outside the city, nearby fields experienced major damage due to the neglect of public works. In this case, there was no proper drainage system to handle flooding waters. With Constantine, there were further developments with the Christian church, with the Christian community. The palace of Constantine's second wife became a residence for the Bishop of Rome. Constantine directed gifts of food to churches which improved their charitable efforts. He saw the restoration of confiscated property to the church and the allocation of large resources going to Christians. He financed church construction and the production of the Bible. Churches destroyed in the previous decades were rebuilt, and there was rapid building of new churches, including in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. To initiate the restoration of Jerusalem as a Christian city, he sent his mother, Helena, to the Holy Land. Former pagan temples were transformed into Christian churches. Beyond stone and mortar, there were major improvements for believers. For example, Christian leaders did not have to participate in public service, pay taxes, or appear before civic court. They were granted trial before a church court. One consequence of these actions was that some clergy entered the privileged class. One church historian suggests that Constantine's object was to, quote, raise and strengthen a hierarchy of ecclesiastical supporters than to give full scope to the doctrine of truth, end of quote. So in this case, we have an historian being critical that Constantine really was doing things more political than in a sense of genuine piety and favor for Christianity. But nonetheless, he did give clergy the power to free slaves during prayer services. In the year 316, he made it illegal to tattoo the faces of criminals because it is formed in the likeness of heavenly beauty, end of quote. So no tattoos on the faces of criminals. He also forbid crucifixion. Until 323, Constantine shared the empire with Licinius. Licinius controlled the eastern half. However, Licinius began to favor pagan gods and show greater hostility to Christians. A non-Christian, Licinius was nonetheless fearful of the power of the Christian God. Constantine invaded Licinius' territory in the year 322, and 2 years later defeated his rival and gained control of the whole empire. In his mind, quote, Christianity was the completion of the process of unification which had long been in progress in the empire. It had one emperor, one law, and one citizenship for all free men, end of quote. Consequently, now it should have one religion. With the triumph of Christianity, there was change with Roman amusements. The pagan emperors had supported violent gladiatorial events. Christians condemned the events for their violence, but also because gladiatorial contests honored pagan gods, caused rage and grief, and were sites for betting. Usually, gladiators were refused baptism until they renounced the activity. Well, Constantine prohibited gladiator events. Constantine's baptism in the year 327 signaled additional changes. The burning of incense had been a common activity that demonstrated respect for an emperor. This activity began to occur in Christian churches. Church leaders were increasingly referred to priests, as had been the practice in pagan years. So in paganism, you had priests. The priests, Christian priests, adopted more luxurious attire rather than simple everyday clothing. The communion table was now referred to as an altar, and certain hand gestures showing respect became part of Christian worship. Justo Gonzalez identifies other changes. Before one did not kneel for prayer on Sundays. That was the day of adoption, when Christians approached the throne of the Most High as children and heirs of the great King. Now, one always knelt for prayer, as petitioners usually knelt before the emperor. Services began with a processional, and choirs were developed to give body to that procession. All these changes reduced the active worship, the active worship role of congregations. Also, it became common to build churches where martyrs had been buried. In fact, the relics of a martyr was believed to enhance worship, and the bodies of martyrs there were bodies of martyrs on earth and placed under church altars. People began to believe that the relics and the bodies of the martyrs had miraculous powers. When Empress Helena was in the Holy Land, she believed she found the very cross of Christ. This cross and any pieces of wood from it had miraculous power, so many believed. In response to the many changes, various church leaders discouraged any exaggerations or superstitious extremes. However, they were often overwhelmed by the number of people flocking to the churches. In the past, there was a long term of training and teaching for anyone about to receive baptism. Now, people were baptized with minimal understanding of what baptism meant. Another change was the building of more elaborate churches, a significant contrast with the simplicity of early churches. In fact, when we go further back in the early part of the Roman Empire, there was often the Christians met at simple households, at people's homes. Local residents now were expected to assist with their labor and materials, the building of a church. Most churches had a rectangular plan of the basilica, and they consisted of three main parts: the atrium, the naves, and the sanctuary. People entered the church at the atrium, where there was a fountain for performing ritual washing. In these early, rather elaborate churches, there were 3 and possibly 5 naves, which were the most spacious section of a church. The illustration, the photo, shows 3 naves of an ancient church, an ancient basilica. The sanctuary was located at the end of the nave in a way that gave the floor plan the shape of a cross. On the walls of the basilica were lamps and tapestries. Baptisms took place in a nearby building. Baptism in the baptism pool was usually by full immersion, but the pouring of water on the heads of those baptized was another method. So after Constantine, what we see with the church is a mixing of the traditional and the new. Before Constantine, emperors had sought to restore the glory of the Roman Empire, but Constantine was the first to choose Christianity rather than paganism as the vehicle to see this happen. The creation of Constantinople as the capital city was an important development. It was to be a Christian city without any pagan associations. The new center of a Christian empire, Constantinople became home for Constantine in the year 330. The city anchored the Eastern Roman Empire, also, of course, referred to as the Byzantine Empire. This new Rome likely diminished the power of the aristocratic and mostly pagan families of Rome. A major setback for paganism was the raiding of pagan temples. Constantine ordered the removal of pagan statues, and thus the ancient shrines lost the gods that were the object of local devotion. Constantine remains a fascinating subject. Scholar Rodney Stark has an interesting assessment of Constantine's late baptism. Quote, if Constantine delayed his baptism until shortly before his death, that was not proof of his previous lack of piety, but was such a common practice that even St. Ambrose had done so. The reason for such delays was that since baptism washed away all prior sins, with death close at hand, there would be little time to pile up a new set of infractions requiring a lengthy atonement after death. End of quote. Historian Justo Gonzalez discusses other reasons to argue that Constantine should not be seen as a mere opportunist, such as his poor timing to seek Christian assistance, the modest number of Christians in the army, and the uncommonness of a politician using religion in such a calculating manner. There is scant evidence of a regenerated heart in the emperor, but the historically significant fact is not his personal acceptance of Christianity, but rather his policy as a statesman who saw the value of Christianity as an instrument of worldly power. The debate on Constantine remains a lively one. Some claim that the military sign of a cross his soldiers painted on their shields was an emblem linked to the cult of Zeus. There is also the argument that Constantine's vision was of the sun god rather than Christ. Critics point out that he kept the pagan title Pontifex Maximus and showed little effort to stop animal sacrifices, which he deplored. The coins of the era referred to paganism, including images of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. In 321, his reason for declaring the first day of the week a public holiday was to respect the venerable day of the sun. Even Christians, just to sum things up, to conclude, even Christians in the early 4th century were divided on what to think of Constantine. Most apparently believed he was favored by God. They rejoiced that their place in the empire was safer and more acceptable. Other Christians were less impressed. They saw the church as tainted by the joining of empire and Christianity. For many, the best path was to be loyal to the emperor, understanding that their ultimate loyalty was to the King of Kings. Richard Todd, a scholar on Constantine, offers a good summary point of Constantine's faith. Quote, Constantine's attitude towards the Christian church after he became emperor and his new laws demonstrated that his allegiance to Christianity was genuine, though his understanding of the Christian faith was at first no doubt imperfect. End of quote. In the end, Constantine's conversion resulted in significant changes in church life. It was the start of a new era that generated both excitement and caution. Thank you.